Okay, so my take on the next Korean War, okay, it's my speculation, it's based on my analysis of a lot of stuff. I do not have access to any secret information on this, okay? Nobody's given me any kind of a briefing or secret briefing, and I'm not claiming to have access to any special people or anything like that. People that I have known in the intelligence community pretty much don't have anything to do with Korea. Okay, they're not experts on it. They don't study it. It's not their part of the world to deal with. But I've looked into this. I've done some research on it. How would the invasion? How would the war go? Well, North Korea would be making a lot of noise. The rest of Asia would be saying somebody needs to do something about it. Somebody probably has a bunch of meetings in Beijing and comes to the conclusion that Japan really cannot diplomatically send military forces to get involved. Nobody else is going to allow that. They just don't want it. They don't want a remilitarization of Japan. But Japan could probably set up at least a partial sea blockade out here. And for that matter, the Russians could too. The idea is for the rest of these Asian powers to set up containment on North Korea. They would probably not set up a complete blockade of all trade. What they would be setting up is military containment. The North Koreans aren't in a position to do a hell of a lot about that because they don't have a lot of big ocean capable navy. So with the Japanese and the Russians setting up containment in here, I see that happening. South Koreans setting up a level of containment. So I would venture to guess you're going to have a containment line here in the early stages of a build-up to any conflict. You would also have a lot of Chinese presence in this body of water here. And again, the Chinese would be looking at containment. They also will be speaking a lot about wanting to contain the area against fighting from, let's say, U.S. forces that might be going back and forth. They wouldn't want like U.S. fighters and bombers, let's say, taking off in South Korea and flying around the long way and maybe crossing a little bit too close to what they consider to be Chinese turf on raids into North Korea. Or let's say American carrier groups operating out here. The Chinese would start probably declaring turf as things get a little bit closer to their area. So I would venture to guess this area, the Chinese are going to want to contain a lot, although there would be some U.S. carrier groups operating here, maybe here, and of course there's fixed U.S. bases here, and they are capable of heading all the way into North Korea with the way the aircraft work. They can pretty much handle those types of distances. But remember, you're looking at aircraft having 350-ish mile range, and they got to do two ways, right? And then they would have time loitering on target. And one of the reasons they have air bases as close as possible is you increase time loitering on target during that conflict. But who gets ground forces in there? U.S. Marine Corps just isn't big enough anymore to do a amphibious invasion out here. U.S. Marine Corps plus the Army doing an amphibious invasion against the will of the Chinese. I don't think that's realistic. Okay, if they did an amphibious invasion over here, the Chinese may not be wanting to reach all around that to do anything about it. It's possible, but unlikely that the containment force out here would also include an invasion force unless maybe somebody wanted to go nipping off a corner of this or something like that. I just personally, somebody might rattle some sabers. I just don't see it happening. Although it's possible. It's possible that a U.S. force could make a deal with the Russians, could make a deal with the Japanese and move in from the north through this way. It's also possible that a U.S. force, as part of an international force, could do that. But what I do see on this long border, and with the ability of China right now to project power, the Chinese could invade this stuff and wrap it up relatively quickly. And with the rest of the world containing North Korea, I could see China being justified in an invasion strictly on humanitarian grounds. We're not talking about just business grounds. I'm talking about on humanitarian grounds. The Chinese would be basically backing up, let's say, a local revolution in North Korea, which would actually be a communist revolution against the dictatorship. And they would be doing it on humanitarian terms because of food and other resource shortages in North Korea. I believe the rest of the world would accept China invading North Korea on humanitarian terms if they went to the UN with a offer beforehand of brokering the reunification of Korea. And it could be that those negotiations are taking place right now. If that were to happen, there would be international containment force working this ocean right here, possible land invasions here through an international force, although they may just hold off and wait for the Chinese to move in on Pyongyang. And the South Koreans would mainly be doing speed bump duty or trying to take some key installations in here just to play the Me Too game on saying that they're there and occupying some stuff depending on what the North Koreans do. But at some point, the guys who are going to end up owning the most real estate on this is going to be the People's Liberation China Army of China. They would be the people who end up owning the most real estate. During the last Korean War, it was the Chinese who really ended up owning that real estate, and it took the entire rest of the UN to draw that line between North and South Korea. So with the entire rest of the UN drawing that line, and the Chinese really owned all of this, and then the Chinese communists created the North Korean regime along with the Russian communists. We know that North Korea obviously isn't going to have a lot of Russian support at this point, and the Chinese are just going to see it in their own best interest to run that place themselves. The question is whether or not they would commit the lives of their soldiers to that end. And that's a question for Chinese politics at this stage in the game. It's a question of whether or not they would want to make that commitment in return for an ownership stake in a lot of North Korean resources after Korean reunification. Because I think the UN would probably, given their current mood, they would probably go along with that. So what we'd be looking at is Chinese invasion from the north and from the west, possible international force doing a containment perimeter on the east, and possibly an amphibious invasion somewhere in this area. South Korea probably running a lot of special operations into the southern parts of North Korea. I can see a lot of South Korean special operations going into here, but are they going to go and take and hold a lot of real estate with conventional forces? Probably not. I don't see them as being entirely capable of crossing the DMZ. I just don't think they can do that. They would have to circumvent the DMZ and then go in amphibious or air. I just don't see them just forcing their way across the DMZ. It could happen. I just don't personally think that's how it would roll. But that's how I see the next Korean War going down. And it's going to be a question, the place where those decisions are actually going to be made is Beijing. Those are the people who are actually going to make the decisions on how that's going to roll, not the United States. Our military there is too small. What we would be doing is making sure that whatever play these other people are going to make is not going to include a land invasion of South Korea. We really cannot afford that to happen. We cannot afford for that to happen on our watch, where the rest of the world could say, well, you know, having the U.S. as your ally doesn't mean anything. There are European nations who have been told that, and they've unfortunately had to deal with the fact that, yeah, the U.S. has not invaded. The U.S. couldn't prevent any invasions in Europe, not by force. By negotiation, yes, and of course, saber rattling during the Cold War. But there's not too many European nations that were saved by the United States prior to a long mobilization effort on the part of the United States. Let's say World War One, World War Two. The U.S. took years to mobilize before actually going in and rescuing Western Europe. Uh, so right now in the Korean situation, those decisions are going to be made in Beijing. I just don't see them being made here. It's possible, but there's too many other players that are local to that area. The Chinese have a tremendously powerful military that they're capable of projecting locally. It is their backyard. They're going to be the people who make the decisions on that. Would the U.S. be included? Yeah, but I keep thinking that the end of gameplay, no matter how it ends up, would be the eventual removal of U.S. forces from South Korea, but probably on relatively diplomatic terms without major loss of life.